Hey everybody, welcome to week 2. This week we are talking about conflict in North America, and I have broken it up by region. So the first 2 parts of the video will be dealing with the South, and the second 2 parts will be dealing with the North. So I want to open today's discussion by telling you all about Pocahontas, and not the Disney movie Pocahontas, but the actual young woman and her life. Pocahontas was born in 1595 and was about 12 when Jamestown was founded in 1607. The portrait of her you see here on the left was done in 1616, 1 year before her death. This was done for the Virginia Company as a way to promote the English colonization and civilization of native peoples. What the portrait doesn't depict is the many tattoos she had on her face as part of her native culture. The English wanted Pocahontas to appear as assimilated as possible. The daughter of Powhatan, it was believed that she saved the life of English Captain John Smith in 1607. Historians now believe that it was probably part of an elaborate ceremony designed by Powhatan himself to demonstrate his power over the colonists and incorporate them into his realm. Pocahontas subsequently became an intermediary between the two peoples, bringing food and messages to Jamestown. In 1613, while visiting the Potawatomi Indians of northern Virginia, Pocahontas was lured aboard Captain Samuel Argall's ship and held captive. Argall, an English navigator and administrator, had, quote, "resolved to possess myself of her by any stratagem that I could use, for the ransoming of so many Englishmen as were prisoners with Powhatan, as also to get arms and tools and some quantity of corn for the colony's relief," end quote. She was taken to the governor at Jamestown, and during the year she was held captive, she was converted to Christianity and baptized. She adopted the Christian name Rebecca. Her conversion was celebrated as a victory for the Virginians and their missionaries. Little is known about her marriage to John Rolfe, taking place in 1614 when she was 19 years old. Her father consented to the marriage as a way to cement ties between the two groups and restore peace between them. After traveling back to England, she caused a sensation in court when they visited James I as a symbol of Anglo-Indian harmony and missionary success. The Rolfes were set to return to Virginia, but Pocahontas never made it back and died in 1617 during the journey. She was about 22 years old. The most prevailing theory is that she died of smallpox or some other European illness like tuberculosis that she had contracted when she went to England. Legends and retellings of her story sprang up not long after her death and continue to this day. There is a monument of her in Jamestown. The figure is a woman of perhaps 18 or 20 years instead of the girl of 12 to 14 who visited the settlers when John Smith was there. She wears clothing more befitting a Western Indian than a Powhatan. The peculiar sandals on her feet are as unknown to her culture as the almost Art Nouveau floral design incised on her vest, both of which are visually appealing but wholly inaccurate. So I just wanted to talk to you about that a little bit, open it up with revisionist history and colonization and sort of the lasting effects of colonization, because we are going to talk about different types of colonization today. And what the English practiced was settler colonialism, and I'll get to that in a few minutes. But the story of Pocahontas is a great example of that type of colonization. So let's talk about Spain. We're going to switch gears for a minute. And as I mentioned, there are different types of colonialism. What the Spanish engaged in is called empire building. The goal with empire building is not to populate the area with a permanent settlement, but instead to extract resources for the wealth of the empire. In this case, that empire was Spain. So now in the future, Spain does set up permanent settlements, but their initial plan is just to extract resources and send them back. So their initial plan is empire building. While the Spanish Empire centered on Mexico, Peru, and the West Indies, the hope of finding a new kingdom of gold soon led Spanish explorers into territory that now forms part of the United States. Multiple expeditions to Florida occurred in the early 16th century, but it wasn't until the 1560s that the Spanish began lasting efforts to settle the area. After destroying a French outpost and killing the settlers who had lived there, nobleman Pedro Menendez de Albiles established Spanish forts on St. Simon's Island in Georgia and St. Augustine in Florida, the second of which, being the oldest site in the United States, continually inhabited by European settlers and their descendants. Spanish expeditions soon established forts from present-day Miami into South Carolina. Spanish missionaries set up outposts, hoping to convert natives to Catholicism. You'll remember I had talked about the urgency of colonization in terms of different religious practices in Europe and the desire to spread the faith as far and wide as possible in new lands. So the Spanish were very adamant about that with their religion of Catholicism. Several of the forts fell into disuse, and many of the missions were destroyed by local Guale Indians in an uprising that began in 1597. The natives explained their revolt and that the missionaries wanted to eliminate, quote, our dances, banquets, feasts, celebrations, and wars. They persecute our old people by calling them witches. Florida failed to gain large numbers of settlers, and in 1763 had only about 4,000 people of European descent. The Spanish also expanded into the Southwest. After a series of failed ventures similar to early expeditions in Florida, Juan de Onate led a group of 400 soldiers to establish a permanent settlement in 1598. After Onate's nephew and 14 soldiers were killed by natives in Acoma, a city in present-day New Mexico, Onate retaliated in a 2-day siege that laid waste to the city and killed hundreds. The women and children who were captured were placed into servitude, while the men each had 1 foot cut off as punishment. Onate's message was clear. Anyone who resisted Spanish authority would be crushed. In 1606, Onate was ordered home. His failure to find gold was a disappointment, but his treatment of the natives led to his own punishment by Spanish royal authority. In 1610, Spain established the capital of New Mexico at Santa Fe, the first permanent European settlement in the Southwest. And this method of some Europeans, like a handful of Europeans, get killed by a group of natives, and Europeans retaliate by wiping out hundreds of Native Americans, is a pattern that we will continue to see. This unproportional retaliation. Santa Fe became the centralized point of European life in New Mexico, and the area stabilized as the 16th century progressed. However, by 1680, New Mexico's colonial population was still small and vulnerable, numbering around 3,000 people. Most were mestizos, persons of mixed Spanish and native origin, since few European settlers, especially women, had come to the region. As governors, settlers, and missionaries continually sought to exploit the labor of a declining native population, relations between the Spanish and Pueblo Indians began to break down. Franciscan friars often used intimidation and violence in attempts to convert the Pueblo to Catholicism. Some attempted conversion while also holding to their older religious and spiritual beliefs. But as the Inquisition became more intense in Spain, so did the friars' attempts to stamp out traditional religious ceremonies and practices. The burning of masks, idols, and other sacred objects belonging to the Pueblo alienated them in larger quantities than it created conversions. A prolonged drought that began in 1660, along with the Spanish's inability to protect inhabitants from raids by Navajo and Apache Indians, also added to discontent. The Pueblo themselves had been divided, and colonial authorities assumed they would never unite against the Spanish. In August of 1680, they were proven wrong. Little is known about the Tewa man named Pope, who became the main organizer of an uprising that aimed to drive the Spanish from the colony and restore the natives' traditional autonomy. A religious leader born around 1630 in San Juan Pueblo, in present-day New Mexico, Pope first appears in the historical record in 1675, when he was one of 47 Pueblo Indians arrested for sorcery, that is, practicing their traditional religion. After being publicly whipped in Santa Fe for his crime, Pope returned home and began holding meetings with Pueblo communities. Under Pope's leadership, New Mexico's Indians joined in a coordinated uprising. Ironically, because the Pueblos spoke 6 different languages, Spanish was the common language used for the revolt. After 2,000 warriors destroyed isolated farms and missions, they surrounded Santa Fe. The Spanish resisted for a time, but had to flee the town. Within a few weeks, a century of colonization in the area had been destroyed. The Pueblo Revolt was the most complete victory for Native Americans over Europeans and the only wholesale expulsion of settlers in the history of North America. That's really important. The Pueblo destroyed all markers of Spanish rule, including fruit trees, cattle, and churches. Some waded into rivers to wash away their baptisms. Then they rebuilt their traditional places of worship and resumed sacred dances the friars had banned. The cooperation soon evaporated, and by the end of the decade, the Pueblo peoples were warring against one another. Pope died around 1690, and in 1692, the Spanish invaded and reconquered New Mexico. In the 18th century, colonial authorities adopted a more tolerant attitude toward traditional practices and made fewer demands on their Indian labor, lessons they learned from the defeat of their Spanish predecessors. So lots of lasting effects and importance with the Pueblo Revolt there. So let's shift gears and talk about the English and their methods of colonization. Early Jamestown was akin to Spain's empire building, but that changed in later decades and with the settling of New England. The English practiced settler colonialism. I've already touched on this a bit when discussing the European attempts at replacing natives as the indigenous people in America. We talked about that last week. But let me explain it a bit more plainly. In settler colonialism, the idea is not to temporarily settle or extract wealth from the colony. Instead, the goal is to permanently live in the area and take lasting ownership over the land and resources. So there's a reason why I have a picture of a garden here. So think about a garden. The Native Americans are the flowers growing in that garden. In settler colonialism, the English pull the flowers out of the ground, revise the history of the garden, and plant themselves in the flowers' place. So now the garden grows the English as though they've always been there, and the history of that garden has changed to reflect that idea of indigenous English flowers. So it's as though the English themselves are native. So through history, legends, and storytelling, the original native flowers are erased, and the English people's place in the garden is cemented. That is settler colonialism. If you are confused by this, I totally understand because this is a new concept for a lot of people. Listen to this again, and then if you are still not sure what I mean, please send me an email and I'm happy to clarify it for you, okay? All right, and hopefully as we talk about the English and their settlement in Virginia and New England, you will be able to further understand this idea of settler colonialism. In 1607, the first expedition dispatched by the Virginia Company established Jamestown, named for the King of England, as the capital of the colony of Virginia. But despite these bows to royal authority, the Virginia Company was a private business organization whose shareholders included English merchants, aristocrats, and even members of Parliament. Making the first of many mistakes, Jamestown's 104 men and boys pitched their fort on a swampy inland peninsula in order to prevent a surprise attack from the Spanish. Weakened by bouts of disease such as malaria, they died by the scores. And just as an aside, we're in North Carolina. It gets kind of swampy and humid, and there are mosquitoes everywhere. So sometimes in the summer, if I walk outside and it's really humid and full of mosquitoes, I tend to say something like, "Oh man, it's like Jamestown out here." So feel free to use that joke. Not many people will get it, but it's funny, at least to me. So even before the sickness took its toll, many of Jamestown's colonists had little taste for labor. Anxious to participate in mercantilism, an economic doctrine in which strict regulation of exports over imports would lead to a steady flow of gold and silver into the economy, the men in Jamestown searched tirelessly for gold and neglected securing their means of survival. Nevertheless, Jamestown became the first permanent English settlement in what is now the United States. The founding of Jamestown took place at a time of heightened European involvement in North America. Many European kingdoms were beginning to view overseas colonies as essential to a nation's power and prosperity. The founding of Jamestown was quickly followed by the founding of Quebec by France in 1608, and the founding of New Netherland by the Dutch shortly after that. In 1610, as we've already seen, the Spanish established Santa Fe in New Mexico. English North America in the 17th century was a place entrepreneurs sought to make fortunes, religious minorities hoped to worship and create societies without government interference, and aristocrats dreamt of creating a world reminiscent of feudalism. For ordinary men and women, emigration offered an escape from lives of deprivation and inequality. "No man," wrote John Smith, "will go from England to have less freedom in America." Indeed, the charter of the Virginia Company stated that colonists would enjoy all freedoms of those residing in our realm of England. The settlers of English America came to enjoy greater rights than those of other empires, including the power to choose members of elected assemblies, protections of the common law such as the right to trial by jury, and access to land, the key to economic independence. Just as the English established their first outpost on Chesapeake Bay with a set of goals and strategies in mind, so too the natives of that region pursued their own aims and interests. The Indians had recently been consolidated by their leader Powhatan in a powerful confederacy. Powhatan used the English newcomers to advance his own long-standing objectives. Although he considered the new colonists inferior, Powhatan welcomed trade goods and English weapons as a means to consolidate his political authority and to fend off challenges from the Piedmont peoples. And in part 2, we're going to see exactly where that leads.